The church bells were still ringing when the shouting changed direction. Flags hung from the balconies, children ran through the square with scraps of cloth in their hands, and for a brief hour, the town had believed it was free of fear. But freedom shifted quickly when someone called her name from across the street. She had stepped out of a narrow doorway to watch the procession, her coat still worn from winter, her hair pinned without care, when two women seized her arms and pulled her into the open. She stumbled forward onto the cobblestones, losing her balance as the crowd circled around her in a tightening ring. A baker pointed at her and shouted that she had worked the checkpoint during the occupation. Another voice added that she had been seen speaking to uniformed men near the ration table. But the word collaborator spread faster than the bells above them, repeated until it became accusation instead of rumor. Hands gripped her sleeves. Someone pulled her head back by the hair. A pair of scissors appeared from somewhere near the front, raised high enough for others to see, and the crowd shifted from celebration to punishment without hesitation. She tried to speak, but her voice dissolved under the noise. The bells did not stop ringing. Liberation demanded a symbol, and she had become the easiest one to claim. A military jeep rolled into the edge of the square, just as the first strand of her hair was tugged forward for cutting. It did not rush. It did not need to. The Allied markings alone were enough to make several people step aside. The American sergeant stepped down before the engine had gone quiet. He did not shout. On did not draw attention with force. He walked directly into the circle of bodies with the steady pace of someone who had seen cities fall and rise again. The scissors hovered above her head. A man's fist remained tangled in her hair. Without breaking stride, the sergeant placed his hand firmly on the man's wrist and lowered it. Then he stepped fully between her and the crowd. His shoulders squared, his back forming a barrier. The movement was clean and final. The scissors hung uselessly at the side of the man who held them. For a moment the square held its breath. Someone protested that this was local justice. Another shouted that liberation meant consequences. The sergeant did not turn to argue. He simply stood in front of her and said, in an even voice that carried without effort, "She comes with us." Behind him, she straightened slowly, her hair falling back into place, her breath uneven, but no longer trapped by hands. The bells continued ringing above the square, but their sound felt different now. Liberation was still being celebrated, yet in the center of it, a line had been drawn, and for the first time since she was pulled from the doorway, no one touched her again. Though the crowd were testing how far the uniform would go. Several men moved closer, speaking over one another, insisting that liberation had given the town the right to judge its own. A woman whose hands still trembled from pulling at her sleeve shouted that her brother had been taken during the occupation and never returned, and that anyone who stood near the checkpoint should answer for it. The sergeant did not raise his voice to match theirs. He turned slightly, enough to make it clear that he heard them, but not enough to surrender his position in front of her. Two younger soldiers stepped down from the jeep and positioned themselves at the edge of the crowd, not threatening, simply present. It was a subtle shift of weight, a reminder that celebration did not cancel structure. She remained behind him, her hands clasped in front of her coat, her breathing still uneven, aware that protection was not the same as safety. From the far side of the square, the town's provisional civic official pushed through with visible impatience. He had been one of the first to hang a flag that morning, and one of the loudest voices calling for order. Now he addressed the sergeant directly, insisting that this was a civilian matter, and that military forces were guests, not judges. The crowd quieted just enough to hear the exchange. The official argued that during occupation, she had been seen distributing ration slips near the German post, and that several neighbors believed she cooperated willingly. The sergeant listened without interruption, and then asked whether there had been a formal charge filed, whether any record existed beyond shouted memory. The official hesitated. The town had grievances, but not paperwork. Liberation had arrived faster than administration. The tension shifted from anger to uncertainty. Some in the crowd stepped back. Others pressed forward, unwilling to lose the moment. The official insisted that delay would look like favoritism, and that failure to punish collaborators would dishonor those who had suffered. The sergeant responded that Allied command would not allow public punishment without review, that no civilian would be harmed in a street demonstration while military authority stood present. His tone remained steady, but the meaning was firm. He gestured toward the municipal building at the edge of the square, now partially repurposed as a temporary Allied coordination office, and informed the official that the matter would be examined there under formal supervision. Murmurs spread again. Some shouted in protest, others in reluctant acceptance. Without theatrics, he stepped aside just enough to indicate movement and motioned for her to walk toward the building. She did not look at the crowd as she passed. She kept her eyes forward, aware that every step away from the center of the square might still be contested. 2 soldiers followed at measured distance, not restraining her, but framing the path. The official trailed behind, determined not to relinquish his claim. As they reached the building steps, the bells above the square began to slow, their rhythm fading into irregular echoes. Liberation continued in fragments across the town, but here, the celebration had been replaced by procedure. The door to the municipal building opened, and the sergeant held it long enough for her to pass through first, shifting the conflict from stone and shouting into a room where voices would have to lower themselves to be heard. The municipal building no longer felt like the center of local authority. Desks had been rearranged, maps pinned over faded notices, and the air carried the mixed scent of dust and engine oil from soldiers moving in and out since dawn. She stood just inside the doorway while the sergeant crossed to a long wooden table where intake ledgers were stacked in uneven piles. The civic official entered behind them without invitation, positioning himself near the window as though proximity alone granted oversight. A junior Allied clerk looked up uncertainly, recognizing tension without understanding its origin. The sergeant requested her name and occupation during the years of occupation, and the clerk began turning pages through lists of ration distribution workers, checkpoint assistants, onto and temporary labor assignments recorded by the former administration. Each page carried traces of hurried ink and incomplete entries, evidence of a system that had functioned under coercion rather than order. Her name appeared in 2 separate columns. The first marked her as assigned to ration verification near the northern checkpoint. The second noted her temporary duty distributing bread permits in winter of the previous year. The civic official stepped forward immediately, tapping the page as though the ink itself were confession. He reminded the room that the checkpoint had been supervised by occupying forces and that anyone stationed nearby must have cooperated to remain there. The clerk hesitated, glancing toward the sergeant for direction. The sergeant did not react to the accusation immediately. He asked instead whether there were disciplinary reports attached to her file, whether any formal commendations or warnings existed, and whether her assignment had been voluntary or conscripted. The clerk shook his head slowly. The column marked assignment basis listed civic labor requirement, a designation often used when local residents were compelled to serve under threat of penalty. The discovery did not resolve anything. It complicated it. Being compelled did not erase suspicion in the eyes of those who had suffered. The civic official argued that many townspeople had refused such assignments and paid the price in imprisonment or worse. He suggested that survival alone did not prove innocence. The sergeant acknowledged the statement without endorsement. He understood too well that war forced impossible decisions on civilians. He asked the clerk to retrieve supplementary ration logs from the annex cabinet, specifically winter records, when food shortages had been severe. As the clerk left to search, the room fell into a strained quiet, broken only by distant celebration, still filtering through open windows. She remained standing, hands folded, offering no defense beyond the steadiness of her posture. When the supplementary logbooks were placed on the table, The sergeant began reviewing them with deliberate attention. Several entries in her handwriting appeared consistent, but subtle irregularities caught his eye. Altered distribution totals, marginal notes indicating redirection of surplus bread to specific households, marked with small symbols. The civic official frowned at the notations, uncertain whether they indicated misconduct or something else entirely. Though the sergeant did not yet draw a conclusion. Instead, he closed the ledger and informed the room that suspicion alone would not dictate outcome. The records required further review, and until that review was complete, she would remain under Allied supervision rather than public custody. The civic official objected again, but the decision had shifted from rumor to documented ambiguity. The room no longer held a simple accusation. It held a question that could not be answered by shouting in the square. He did so with the care of someone who understood that ink could carry the weight of accusation or redemption. He asked the clerk to step outside with the civic official for a moment, while he examined the entries more closely. Not to exclude authority, but to quiet the room long enough to see what shouting had already tried to decide. She remained standing across the table, her eyes fixed on the worn wood, rather than on him, as though any direct appeal might weaken her position. The first irregularity he noticed was not a missing total, but a pattern. Certain households near the river district consistently received slightly higher bread allocations than their listed size justified. And the symbols in the margins, small crosses or dots barely visible, appeared beside names of families whose men had been taken earlier in the occupation. He turned another page and found that on weeks when supply convoys were reduced by German requisition, the totals distributed under her supervision still matched the expected number of civilian mouths in town. The math did not align with collaboration. It suggested adjustment. He asked her, without accusation, whether she had modified ration totals during shortages. She answered quietly that the checkpoint officers rarely checked civilian columns closely, focusing instead on requisition figures destined for their own barracks. When winter tightened and bread shipments were halved, she shifted small portions from those requisition columns back into civilian lines, thus spreading the deficit thinly enough that it escaped notice. The symbols were reminders to herself of which families had already lost income or protection. The risk had not been dramatic, but it had been constant. A single discovery would have meant arrest. The sergeant listened without interruption, then compared her explanation to the ledger margins. The pattern aligned too precisely to dismiss as coincidence. When the civic official and clerk returned, he presented the evidence not as defense but as fact. The official initially rejected the interpretation, arguing that altered figures could also imply concealment of collaboration. The sergeant countered by pointing to requisition records from the occupying administration, which showed no surplus reaching German units beyond expected totals. If she had been diverting supplies to them, the numbers would have risen, not fallen. Instead, the distribution logs indicated that civilian allotments remained unexpectedly stable through the harshest months. The room grew quiet for a different reason now. What had appeared to be proximity to power might have been proximity used against it. The revelation did not transform the civic official into an ally, but it unsettled certainty. Liberation had simplified guilt into categories, yet survival under occupation had rarely obeyed clean lines. The sergeant closed the ledger once more and stated that her actions, while technically outside strict allocation rules, had demonstrably favored civilians rather than occupiers. He informed the official that further review would continue, but that preliminary findings contradicted the accusation of willing collaboration. She did not smile, nor did she seek gratitude. She only exhaled slowly, as though releasing air she had held for months. Outside, celebration noise persisted, but inside the municipal office the narrative had shifted from rumor to documented nuance. And with that shift, her position moved from defenseless to complicated, a far more stable place to stand than the center of a shouting square. The ledger had barely been returned to its shelf when a messenger from the supply unit entered the municipal office, with dust still clinging to his boots and urgency overriding protocol. An Allied relief convoy scheduled to arrive before dusk had been rerouted unexpectedly due to debris blocking the northern road, and the alternate route marked on the military map passed through narrow residential streets that had suffered partial collapse during the final weeks of occupation. The sergeant listened as the situation was explained in quick, clipped sentences. Food crates and medical supplies were en route, but the driver reported uncertainty about turning clearance and bridge stability. If the convoy stalled in the wrong place, distribution would be delayed by days, and the town's fragile order would thin under renewed shortage. The civic official, who moments earlier had argued for local justice, now argued for immediate coordination, though he admitted that municipal records were incomplete after months of disruption. The sergeant looked across the table at her, aware that the ledger entries had proven something about her past, but had not yet secured her future. He asked whether she knew the smaller lanes behind the river district well enough to guide a vehicle heavier than a civilian cart. She answered that during ration distribution, she had walked nearly every alley to reach households unable to stand in line, and that she knew which streets sloped sharply and which bridges had been reinforced quietly by residents rather than engineers. The civic official hesitated at the suggestion that she accompany a military movement, but the problem of the convoy pressed harder than personal doubt. Time did not favor debate. Within minutes, they stepped back into the square, which still carried the residue of celebration, though its energy had softened. The jeep engine restarted, and the sergeant signaled for the convoy's lead truck to follow at measured distance. She climbed into the passenger side of the jeep without ceremony, her posture steady despite the eyes that tracked her movement from windows and doorways. The civic official remained near the municipal steps, watching the departure with expression unreadable, caught between suspicion and necessity. As the vehicles turned away from the central square, the bells had finally stopped ringing, leaving only engine vibration and scattered cheers from distant streets. They navigated toward the river district where damage was most severe. Rubble narrowed passages to single lanes, and at one corner, she instructed the driver to avoid a cracked culvert hidden beneath loose stone. The sergeant relayed her directions to the convoy through hand signals and brief radio bursts, adjusting speed to maintain control through tight bends. At a partially collapsed archway, she guided them through a side alley scarcely wide enough for a truck mirror, explaining that during winter, she had used the same path to reach families isolated by snow. The convoy cleared the obstacle without scraping steel against brick. With each successful turn, the necessity of her presence became less abstract and more practical. She was no longer merely the woman from the square. She was the only person in the jeep who knew which street would hold weight and which would not. When they reached the supply depot near the southern warehouse, the convoy rolled in without delay. Workers moved quickly to unload crates of flour and medical parcels, relief visible in their efficiency. The sergeant stepped down from the jeep and surveyed the intact vehicles, then glanced toward her as she remained seated, hands resting calmly in her lap. The crisis that had arrived unannounced had been resolved not by argument, but by knowledge carried quietly through occupation and into liberation. In that moment, the questions surrounding her shifted again, not erased entirely, but balanced against action that had served the town more clearly than accusation ever had. The unloading had just begun when the civic official arrived at the depot in a borrowed bicycle cart, his coat unbuttoned and his expression set with renewed urgency. Word of the convoy's safe passage had reached the square faster than the dust from its wheels, and with it came fresh murmurs that her presence beside the sergeant confirmed favoritism rather than necessity. The official dismounted stiffly and approached the jeep where she still sat, addressing the sergeant with a restrained tone that barely concealed frustration. He argued that her involvement in military logistics risked appearing as endorsement before the review process had formally concluded, and that townspeople already questioned whether Allied authority intended to override local governance entirely. The sergeant listened while workers continued moving crates past them, aware that food reaching tables before nightfall mattered more than argument, but also aware that unchecked tension could undo the fragile order they had just secured. The official suggested that another local resident could have guided the convoy if given opportunity, implying that selecting her had been unnecessary. She stepped down from the jeep at that moment, not defensively, but steadily, and explained that most residents avoided certain streets after partial collapses, and that she had learned alternative routes during winter ration rounds because she had no choice. Her tone carried no pride, only fact. The sergeant added that the decision had been logistical, not personal, and that convoy timing had required immediate action rather than committee selection. The official countered that public perception could not be dismissed so easily. Liberation demanded visible fairness. Around them, depot workers slowed subtly, drawn to the exchange though careful not to intrude. The tension sharpened when a junior Allied lieutenant approached, having overheard fragments of the discussion. He questioned whether involving a civilian under review in convoy guidance breached procedural caution. The sergeant recognized the potential fracture. Authority was no longer simply civilian versus military, but layered within the uniform itself. He responded that provisional protection allowed supervised cooperation and that immediate operational success validated the choice. The lieutenant hesitated, glancing toward the official, as if weighing diplomatic balance against strict interpretation of regulation. She remained silent, aware that speaking too much could tilt perception back toward suspicion. To diffuse the escalation, the sergeant proposed formalizing her role temporarily as a civilian logistics assistant under direct supervision, with clear documentation stating that her participation had been instrumental in preventing supply delay. This reframed the issue from personal defense to structured procedure. The lieutenant agreed that such designation maintained both operational efficiency and administrative clarity. The civic official, though not fully satisfied, recognized that the successful delivery of flour and medicine would calm many of the same voices that had shouted in the square. Practical benefits softened ideological rigidity. By the time the final crate was lowered from the convoy truck, then the depot atmosphere had shifted from confrontation to coordination. The sergeant handed the clerk a brief written note, assigning her provisional assistant status pending final record review. It was not a full clearing of suspicion, but it was an acknowledgement that her actions had served the town's immediate need. As workers dispersed to distribute supplies before dusk, the official nodded once, stiffly, accepting that the argument had moved beyond accusation into structured oversight. She stood beside the jeep again, not elevated nor condemned, but positioned within a framework that limited rumors' reach. The shared risk of public perception and institutional scrutiny had not broken their cooperation. Instead, it had forced it into clearer form, binding action to documentation in a way that made the earlier shouting in the square feel distant, though not entirely erased. By late afternoon, the distribution of flour and medical parcels had already begun to ease the strain that hung over the town since morning, and the square that had earlier demanded punishment now gathered again for announcements concerning ration schedules and relief coordination. The sergeant chose that moment deliberately, not for spectacle but for correction, stepping onto the low stone platform near the municipal steps, where local notices had once been posted, and requesting brief attention without raising his voice beyond necessity. The civic official stood beside him, arms folded, but no longer openly resistant, aware that public tension could not remain suspended without direction. Workers from the depot, shopkeepers, and families formed a loose semicircle, their expressions shifting from suspicion to guarded curiosity. The sergeant stated plainly that review of occupation records had revealed her assignment to ration labor had been compulsory, and that documented evidence showed civilian allotments had remained stable during winter shortages, a result inconsistent with voluntary collaboration. He avoided praise yet emphasized contribution, explaining that earlier that day, her knowledge of damaged streets had ensured timely arrival of relief supplies, now being distributed among them. The words were measured, neither absolution nor condemnation, but they altered the axis of perception. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some reluctant, some relieved, as the abstract label that had fueled anger was replaced with verifiable detail. The civic official added, after a brief pause, that provisional protection would remain in effect while final documentation was archived, and that any further accusation must be submitted formally rather than shouted publicly, a concession that signaled alignment with structured order rather than spontaneous retribution. She stood at the edge of the platform, not elevated above others but visible enough to be seen without being isolated. Her posture steady, hands relaxed at her sides rather than clenched. No applause followed, yet neither did renewed hostility. Instead, the square settled into a practical quiet where flour sacks changed hands and mothers adjusted parcels against their hips, and the earlier spectacle of scissors and shouting seemed increasingly misaligned with the immediate reality of bread being weighed and names being checked from updated lists. And the sergeant concluded by announcing a temporary civilian logistics coordination role to assist Allied relief operations during the transitional period, clarifying that her familiarity with neighborhood routes would continue to support supply movement under supervision. This reframed her presence not as tolerated, but as functionally necessary. The civic official nodded once more, signaling that administrative structure had superseded rumor, and stepped back from the platform. As people dispersed, a few avoided her gaze while others met it briefly with acknowledgement rather than accusation. And though full trust had not yet returned, the public narrative had shifted from symbolic punishment to documented contribution. The square resumed its muted rhythm of post-liberation adjustment, and she remained standing upright within it, while no longer an object carried by the crowd's momentum, but a participant defined by recorded action rather than shouted memory. Dusk settled over the town with a softer sound than the bells that had begun the day, and the square gradually emptied as families carried flour sacks indoors and shutters were drawn against the cool evening air. Relief lanterns were lit along the municipal steps where updated ration notices had been pinned, and the earlier circle of accusation existed now only as scuffed marks on the cobblestones. She remained near the depot as final crates were secured, assisting a clerk in copying route adjustments into a temporary ledger under the title of Civilian Logistics Coordination, a designation still provisional, yet written clearly enough to outlast rumor. The sergeant reviewed convoy dispatch notes beside the jeep, his attention divided between orders expected from regional command and the immediate calm that had replaced confrontation. None the civic official approached once more, not with challenge but with measured acknowledgement, stating that documentation would be archived in the morning and that transitional governance required cooperation more than spectacle. It was not apology, but it was acceptance that structure had steadied what emotion had destabilized. As night deepened, a message arrived confirming that additional relief units would remain in the region for several weeks to stabilize distribution, and the sergeant informed her that his assignment would extend temporarily to oversee transport coordination during that period. The information carried no dramatic flourish, yet its implication was practical and forward-looking. The work begun that afternoon would continue, not as defense but as routine. She closed the ledger and handed it back to the clerk, yet aware that the square which had nearly defined her in a single word now held a different entry beside her name. They walked a short distance toward the edge of town, where the convoy trucks were parked for the night, neither speaking about the morning's violence nor pretending it had not occurred. Instead, their conversation moved toward the next day's delivery schedule and which streets required inspection before heavier vehicles attempted passage. The connection between them rested not on spectacle or gratitude, but on shared responsibility carried through fatigue. In the distance, fragments of celebration persisted in isolated bursts of song. Yet here, the mood was quieter, grounded in continuity rather than triumph. Before turning towards separate quarters, the sergeant informed her that any further accusations would pass through formal review channels, and that her provisional status would convert to official civilian appointment pending final signature from regional command. She nodded once, understanding that dignity restored did not erase complexity, but anchored it within documented structure. The town would remember liberation for its flags and bells, but she would remember it for the moment when shouting ceased and work began again under steadier hands. As the lantern light flickered across the parked trucks and the night air cooled the dust raised earlier in the square, both of them prepared for another day, shaped less by spectacle and more by deliberate order. And in that restrained continuation lay a quiet happiness, not declared, not displayed, but sustained by the simple fact that she would walk through the square tomorrow, not as a symbol of blame, but as a participant in rebuilding it.